There are numerous books on the market that attempt to demonstrate the construction of Islamic geometric patterns. These books and their methods of constructing Islamic geometric patterns appear to be predicated on a combination of a visual analysis of historic patterns, knowledge of geometry, and, sadly, speculation. Today I intend to review a book. Well, it's actually an encyclopedia, and this encyclopedia is starting out with 3 volumes. We are going to focus more on volume 1, but we will also have a look at volumes 2 and 3. Now, I can confidently assert that this encyclopedia is grounded in what I would call authentic lineage. And what do I mean by authentic lineage? Well, the design method is referred to as the traditional method. As its name suggests, it is not a recently developed method. It wasn't developed over the last 10, 15, 20, 30, 40, or even 100 years. This method is not derived from speculative theories on how Islamic geometric patterns were historically produced. Rather, it is a rules-based system that has been practiced in secrecy over many centuries. By secrecy, I am referring to a method that has been passed down through generations within family lines. It has remained intact, not forgotten, but withheld over the centuries to safeguard its integrity and its value to its practitioners. While many contemporary approaches to designing Islamic geometric patterns can yield correctly constructed patterns, this is not always the case, even though the final product may appear impressive to the untrained eye. By contrast, the encyclopedia that I'm eager to show you today demonstrates how to correctly construct Islamic geometric patterns. That may sound like a bold claim to make, and I make it in all seriousness given my pragmatic background as a decorative designer and also my academic background having studied architectural ornamentation and the role geometry plays in architectural ornamentation. As I mentioned earlier, this method is referred to as the traditional method. It is a method that has been thoroughly tested over centuries and therefore grounded through generations of application. By way of this encyclopedia, the traditional method of constructing authentically correct Islamic geometric patterns is being made accessible to the world, enabling you and future generations to engage in its practice. Until recently, thanks to its custodian Mohamad Aljanabi, this method faced the risk of disappearing along with its last remaining practitioners. Mohamad inherited the traditional method from his father, who in turn inherited it from his father's uncle. This method was widely practiced up until the mid-20th century, after which it fell out of favour owing to Western cultural influences. The encyclopedia is appropriately titled The Encyclopedia of Islamic Geometric Patterns, and its author is Mohamad Aljanabi. You might be thinking, who am I? And am I even qualified to review such an amazing piece of work as this encyclopedia? So maybe a little bit of background about myself. Back in the late 1980s, early 1990s, so this was before the internet, I completed my master's degree. And a big part of that master's degree was my thesis, which was called The Geometric Laws and Principles in Ornament. So trying to summarize what my thesis was about is actually not that easy, but if I was to summarize it in a way that is relevant to what we will be reviewing, it is understanding that there is a geometric relationship between the smallest part of a pattern and the pattern as a whole. And I believe that with a lot of examples of historic architecture, that there is a proportional relationship between the overall form of the building and the building's smallest details, including the decorative details. So that, in a nutshell, was what my thesis was about. A bit more about my background. When I was completing my thesis, I had to fund myself through university, and I did that by setting up a small business. I was a decorative artist, so this entailed specialising in broken colour finishes, marbling, rag rolling, stippling, etc., but it also involved designing stencil patterns and applying those stencil patterns to walls, floors, and furniture. I know from experience when it comes to, for example, decorating walls with stencil patterns, and this is from a practical application, it is always good to have rectangles because rectangles are easy to repeat across a wall. What I'm saying is that when it comes to creating patterns, the unit that you will be creating and then repeating or tessellating should always be a rectangle. It should not be a hexagon. It should not really be anything else. It is always a rectangle. Even in this modern day and age, if you are designing patterns which you want to upload to a print-on-demand service, for example, you will be uploading a rectangle, not a hexagon, and not anything else. It will always be a rectangle. So this, from a practical perspective, rectangles are the way to go. At first glance, these 3 volumes look impressive, even heavy, and they are. Each volume weighs about 3.5 kilograms with the large format of 260 by 335 millimeters with pages in English and Turkish. But this isn't just paper and ink, it's the result of 50 years of inspiration, vision, planning and persistence. It all began in 1969 when Mohamad participated in a secondary school exhibition. Following on from the exhibition, Mohamad would explore the many streets across the old quarters of Baghdad. The buildings in these streets were decorated with a wealth of geometric patterns. Mohamad would sketch these patterns, then head home to draw and recreate the patterns using the skills he was learning from his father and great-uncle. As an architecture student at Huddersfield Polytechnic in England, Mohamad set up another exhibition. As a result, universities from around England invited him to exhibit his work. This is where the idea of creating an encyclopedia began. But as always, life got in the way. Family commitments, work commitments, changing countries meant that the encyclopedia had to wait. Yet Mohamad kept going with this idea. Mohamad published a puzzle book and a colouring book of patterns, set up a Facebook community for anyone with an interest in drawing Islamic geometric patterns, and developed and taught a number of affordable online courses live in person. The experience of interacting with students and answering their questions helped to continually refine Mohamad's teaching resources by identifying what students needed to know when it comes to drawing patterns. Just as listening to students shaped Mohamad's classes, listening also helped in refining the structure and layout of the encyclopedia. So, what is in the encyclopedia? Volume 1 lays the foundation. There are 9 chapters of theory explaining how geometry, shapes, angles, and proportion are all related. That's 437 pages dedicated to explaining the knowledge and resources that are required in order to construct Islamic geometric patterns. Volume 2 takes you deeper, 644 pages showing how to draw 101 fourfold patterns within a square, every single one step by step. Volume 3, 627 pages, 2 chapters, one for 5-fold patterns within a standard rectangle, another for 6-fold patterns within a root 3 rectangle. That's 81 more patterns, all laid out in both English and Turkish, side by side. And it really is a community effort, with translation from English to Turkish, copy editing, checking every single drawing. This encyclopedia was shaped not just by Mohamad, but by the students, colleagues, and fellow pattern enthusiasts who believe in his vision. The goal is 1001 pattern tutorials, a nod to the 1001 Nights, the Arabian Nights, not for the sake of nostalgia, but because these patterns carry stories too. Stories written in lines, angles, in symmetry and proportion, and rules passed down through time, for too long kept secret. But not anymore. This is no coffee table book, it's a masterwork, a reference, a legacy, and it's just beginning. Future volumes will unlock even more. For example, 4-fold patterns in a root 2 rectangle, 5-fold patterns using rectangles other than the standard rectangle, advanced 4-fold, 5-fold and 6-fold patterns, even 7-fold patterns and 9-fold patterns, patterns containing 16 petal rosettes, and complex patterns. This initial 3-volume box set isn't just for designers or historians, it is for anyone who wants to understand what happens when beauty and precision are bound by rules, and how a simple set of rules can lead to a seemingly infinite number of related patterns. This encyclopedia embodies the conservation of a traditional design practice. Let's have a look at Chapter 1. Chapter 1 is all about the properties of Islamic geometric patterns. That is, the key features or mathematical concepts behind the art constructing Islamic geometric patterns. We are looking at symmetry, and when we are talking about symmetry, we are looking at reflective symmetry, radial symmetry, rotational symmetry, and point symmetry. Now, this chapter also covers dynamic symmetry, which is different to the others. So by dynamic symmetry, we are talking about dynamic rectangles and the proportions of those rectangles, because those rectangles are a starting point for creating Islamic geometric patterns. And as I mentioned earlier, rectangles are easier to lay out on a surface. Chapter 1 also covers the mathematical series, and this relates to 4-fold, 5-fold, and 6-fold patterns, just as dynamic symmetry relates to 4-fold, 5-fold, and 6-fold patterns. And also what is covered in this chapter is the proportional relationship between the shapes that make up a pattern. And not necessarily the relationship between the shapes, but the proportions of those shapes. That is, in the relationship of the lines in terms of their length and angles that make up that shape. That's probably the best way that I can put it for now. Also, this chapter covers families. Families are the classification scheme applied to Islamic geometric patterns based on the properties and angles which I just mentioned. And by angles, I'm talking about that mathematical series, because the mathematical series is all about setting out the angles for 4-fold, 5-fold patterns and 6-fold patterns. Every time we talk about dynamic symmetry, proportions, the mathematical series, they are all related. This is Chapter 1 in a nutshell. We are on to Chapter 2, and Chapter 2 is, I guess, is a short chapter, and it's all about understanding the classification of Islamic geometric patterns in a little bit more depth. What I'm talking about here is initially I mentioned 4-fold, 5-fold, and 6-fold patterns. In Chapter 2, we're now categorizing them as primary symmetry systems. That is, primary symmetry systems are 4-fold symmetry systems, 5-fold symmetry systems, and 6-fold symmetry systems. There are some symmetry systems that are categorized using the traditional method as secondary symmetry systems. These are, for example, your 7-fold, your 9-fold, and your 11-fold patterns. These patterns are regarded as secondary because the number of patterns that you can create under those secondary symmetry systems is somewhat more limited. For example, if you are going to create a 9-fold symmetry system to create a 9-fold pattern, or a pattern that combines both 9-fold and 6-fold symmetry systems, the precursor for that is the 6-fold symmetry system. So that's going to be your starting point. Basically what I'm saying is that when creating a secondary symmetry system, you're starting with the primary symmetry system. Also, you may be wondering, well, we've talked about 4-fold, 5-fold, and 6-fold. We've now talked about 7-fold, 9-fold, and 11-fold. But what about, for example, if you've got a pattern which someone might say is 16-fold, because there is a rosette in that pattern that has 16 petals? What you've essentially got is a 4-fold pattern. It's not a 16-fold pattern. So we are back to the basics. 4-fold, 5-fold, 6-fold patterns are primary symmetry systems, and your secondary symmetry systems are, for example, your 7-fold, 9-fold, and 11-fold symmetry systems. As you work through from Chapter 1 to Chapter 2, you will start to see how all of these are related, and I think I touched on this a little bit earlier. When we are talking about symmetry, we are talking about dynamic symmetry, we are also talking about proportion, we are talking about the mathematical series of angles, and also we are talking about the proportional relationship between the shapes and between the lines that make up the shapes. We are also talking about the proportional relationship of the dynamic rectangles. The angles that we will generate within those rectangles, the same angles from the mathematical series. So everything is related. And that leads on nicely to Chapter 3, because in Chapter 3, we start to look at the rules which help you to start thinking about patterns in a more structured way. And by structured, I mean the rules that help you to build out that pattern. And then in Chapter 4, we start to look at that technique in more detail. You'll start to see that within this encyclopedia, within Volume 1, as you move from chapter to chapter to chapter, more information begins to unfold. And all the information is always related by the same angles, the same proportions, the same rectangles, or at least in terms of working with a limited set of rectangles called dynamic rectangles, to create the framework of construction lines on which you will draw out your pattern. Let's move on to Chapter 3. And Chapter 3 is all about the rules. Rules are useful because with rules you can draw things correctly. Without rules, chances are you might make a mistake. So think of the rules as being there for guidance, and that guidance is extremely useful. Rule number 1. Patterns are constructed within a square or rectangle of specific proportions. What we are talking about here is the square and also those rectangles which have been mentioned already, the root rectangles. And we are going to look at those in more detail a bit further down the track in Chapter 5 and Chapter 9. So we will refer to rule number 1 in greater detail when we look at Chapter 5. Rule number 2 is a very practical rule. If you are a decorator and you don't want to waste a lot of time, because time is money, then rule number 2 is a very practical rule. Okay, so rule number 2. Only a quarter of the pattern is constructed. As a general rule, you only need to draw a quarter of the unit that you will be tessellating. We can then, for example, use tracing paper to flip that pattern and just trace out the pattern, and then I can flip it again and trace that out, and flip it again and trace that out. So we don't need to spend a lot of time drawing every single construction line for each quadrant of the unit that will be repeated. I call it a unit because it's not the pattern. It is the unit that will be used and will be repeated that is tessellated to create the pattern. Okay, so that is rule number 2. Rule number 3. Generally, all similar shapes within a pattern must be identical in size. I say generally because there are some exceptions to rule number 3, and that is covered in this chapter. Rule number 4. All shapes in any pattern must have at least one axis of symmetry. This is incredibly important, and it's also incredibly useful if you are looking at a pattern that someone else has drawn. Because when I look at other people's patterns, that's one of the first things I look at. I look at the shapes and I look for lines of symmetry in those shapes. If there are shapes with no line of symmetry within a pattern that someone else has drawn, then I instantly know that that pattern hasn't been drawn correctly. And as much as I might have been intrigued enough to give it a go myself, as in to recreate that pattern, I know that I'd just be wasting my time because it sort of failed the first test, because it has one or more shapes which has no symmetry. Rule number 5. All polygons and stars must be regular if they appear in their respective symmetry system. All polygons and stars must be regular if they appear in their respective symmetry system. So if you're using a 5-fold symmetry system and you end up with some pentagons within your design, those pentagons must be regular pentagons. That is, the internal angles are all 108 degrees. If it's not, and this is a 5-fold pattern that you've drawn and your pentagon is not regular, that means your pentagon is distorted, and that means you haven't drawn your pattern correctly. The same goes for hexagons in a 6-fold pattern. They must be regular hexagons. Rule number 6. All angles in the shapes must be equal to one of the terms in the corresponding mathematical series. Again, we are really just talking about the same things from chapter to chapter, but here we are establishing a rule. What that means again, and this is another useful test when looking at other people's patterns that have been drawn using other methods, it's a nice check to see whether it has been drawn correctly. Again, you'll be able to determine that the pattern is not drawn correctly if the angles do not correspond exactly with the relevant mathematical series for that particular symmetry system. And again, if it was a pattern that you're intrigued with and you're thinking of giving it a go, by checking the angles, you can eliminate whether it's worth your while, because if it's drawn incorrectly, why would you want to recreate it? Rule number 7. Lines should be drawn between two known intersection points. I really like this approach because it allows you to work logically in terms of building up your construction lines. So what do we mean by two known intersection points? The thing is, when you're swinging your compass and you're using a straight edge, you want to establish points around the perimeter of the square or the rectangle that you're starting with. Once you have some of those points established, you can start to join those points up with lines, and some of those lines will intersect. Some of those lines will intersect some of the arcs you've drawn. Some of those lines will intersect some of the existing lines that you have drawn, that is, the straight lines you have drawn. And you'll start to learn that some of those intersection points can be connected to from points on the edge of the rectangle that you've already established, or from other intersection points within the rectangle that you have established. Basically, you're connecting point to point. You're establishing those points as you build out your construction lines to construct the framework upon which you will be drawing your pattern. Rule number 8. Rule number 8 is about the arrangement of the lines in the pattern, and that arrangement can determine whether the pattern is considered strong, weak, or simply undesirable. What's an example of that? If you consider two lines which cross over each other, they need to continue in a straight line. If they do, that is considered strong. If at that point the angle changes a little, then that is considered weaker. There are more examples of how to distinguish between a strong, weak, or undesirable pattern in rule number 8. Let's have a look at Chapter 4. Chapter 4 covers the tools, the techniques, and the skill set. Very quickly, we will brush over the tools that you need in order to draw Islamic geometric patterns from scratch. What you're going to need is, for example, a good quality compass. You don't want one of those compasses which collapse under you when you're trying to draw a circle. You need a good quality professional compass. Also, pencils, erasers, and a good drawing surface and a straight edge or ruler. A drafting mat is really useful. If your eyesight is anything like mine, you might find it actually useful to wear a headset, and a headset like this helps you to draw with greater precision. What you're going to look at now is the technique that is pretty much common to drawing all Islamic geometric patterns. As mentioned, we have looked at some of the rules. So one of the first rules is to draw a quadrant of the pattern, and to draw that within the confines of a square or a particular rectangle. Now you've seen this particular quadrant before because you saw me tracing it and then using it to draw the complete unit that will be tessellated. So what we are going to look at now, because I didn't show you before, is the construction lines used to determine where the pattern lines will fall. Let's have a look at the technique. Basically, we are starting off with a square. We are drawing an arc, as in step 1, drawing two diagonal lines, joining point to point as per the rules by joining the opposite corners of the square. Then in step 3, we are using an internal point which is the intersection of one of the diagonals and the first arc that we drew to set the radius for another arc which is then drawn in 3 of the corners of that square, and that produces even more intersection points that we can make use of. In step 4, again we are joining point to point to establish those red lines, and in step 5 we are using some internal points to establish a new radius and we are going to use that radius to draw 3 arcs in 3 of the corners of the square. Then in step 7, again, we are using some internal points to establish another radius, and we are drawing 2 arcs with that radius. In step 8, it's a matter of connecting more points, and in step 9, we can see once we've traced over those construction lines, we now have a quadrant of a pattern, which when reflected in the x-axis, and then both quadrants are reflected in the y-axis, we have a complete unit, and we can then tessellate this unit. That, in a nutshell, is the technique or method of construction that is common to all traditional method drawn patterns. It's pretty straightforward, isn't it? Chapter 5. We are onto those rectangles that I've mentioned a few times before. And I'm talking about the square in particular, and also the root rectangles or dynamic rectangles as they are sometimes called. Using the root 2 rectangle as an example, let's have a look at the rest of chapter 5, and we are just going to skim through this. What we are looking at in chapter 5 is step-by-step instructions on how to build a square, along with how to build some of these rectangles. I'm just going to take a bit of a scroll through this chapter, just so that you can see, as I've just mentioned, the steps involved in creating some of these rectangles. We may stop and have a look at one, maybe have a look at the root 2 rectangle and how that may be constructed using a compass and straight edge. As we have a look through chapter 5, there are initially some instructions on how to create a square. I'm not going to go into that in detail. I'll just put these slides up briefly so that you can have a look and see that with a compass and straight edge, you can easily draw a square. And then you can take that square and by scribing another arc, you can construct a root 2 rectangle. For example, on page 169, we've got our square. We've got that initial arc that we've seen before when we first looked at drawing the quadrant of a pattern, and that gave us point B. It also gave us the opportunity to draw more arcs, or 2 more arcs, and these arcs will intersect at the top left and top right corner of what will become the root 2 rectangle. We have established one dimension, and that is the height of the rectangle that we are drawing. Then by swinging the compass, we can establish the point at which we will find the corners of that rectangle. That is the top left and top right corners. And there we have it. We have the root 2 rectangle. The length of the long side divided by the length of the short side equals the square root of 2. To summarize chapter 5 is all about showing you how to draw the square and a basic set of dynamic rectangles that you can use to construct Islamic geometric patterns. Chapter 9 expands on this subject with more examples of dynamic rectangles and some simple methods of, for example, combining dynamic rectangles from the same symmetry system to create more rectangles that you can use. That is chapter 5 and chapter 9 covered. Now it's time to move on to chapter 6. Chapter 6, I guess you could say, it doubles down on what we have learned already. Fundamentally, it is about a systematic approach. So this is a systematic approach to analyzing patterns. It is also a systematic approach to constructing patterns. And as I've sort of mentioned before, and this is my own spin on it in terms of the way that I use the words, you have a quadrant, you have a unit, and you have a pattern. The quadrant is generally the non-repeatable unit or part of the pattern. These terms are often used interchangeably, but as long as you've got it clear in your head conceptually that there is a quarter of the pattern, this is the quarter that is generally non-repeatable in the sense that you can't in all instances use it and rubber stamp it to create a pattern, you need to turn it into a repeatable unit that you can then repeat to create the pattern. The quarter of the pattern, for most patterns, could be called a non-repeatable unit, but when you flip it in its x-axis and its y-axis, what you end up with is a unit that can be repeated or to use the correct term, it can be tessellated by translation, just moving it across the surface, just like you would do when you're laying out a pattern on a ceiling, wall, or floor. And that is tessellation. Conceptually, we have covered that already. In Chapter 6, it goes into it in greater detail, and there are lots of examples. I'm not going to cover them in great detail here because it is a big chapter. I think as long as you understand those concepts about constructing a quarter of the pattern, or quadrant, and the unit that is made up of those 4 quadrants, and the tessellation of that unit to create the pattern, that is the important thing to remember. Chapter 7. Chapter 7 expands on the idea of tessellation. Now, I've talked about it, and I'm going to repeat it again. The way that I like to think of it is you are laying out the framework of your construction lines within a quadrant, using the construction lines to build a quarter of the pattern, and using 4 of those quadrants to create a unit, and then you are tessellating that unit. So even the process of lining up your quadrants to create 4 quadrants, either through reflection or translation, that is still called tessellation, because tessellation in its simplest form is a pattern formed by geometric shapes that fit together perfectly, leaving no gaps or overlaps. You can tessellate your quadrant to create the unit. That's one way that you can put it, and then you can tessellate your unit to create the pattern. Back to Chapter 7. In Chapter 7, there are 3 types of tessellation, and when we talk about 3 types of tessellation, we are moving down into the tessellation of the quadrant. And that, as I think I've mentioned already, we've covered one type. So the first type of tessellation, and that is where you reflect the quadrant in the x-axis or y-axis first, and then correspondingly in the y-axis or x-axis, depending on what you did first. So that we have covered. Now we are looking at the second type of tessellation, and the second type of tessellation is where all you're doing is taking that quadrant and moving it to the side or moving it below. You're not reflecting it, you're not rotating it in any way, it's just pure translation. And that gives you a unit of 4 quadrants, and then you can tessellate that unit just like before. The third type of tessellation is where you start off with your quadrant that you have drawn and you reflect it in one axis, and then you translate it in the other axis. Those are the 3 types of tessellating the quadrant. Also covered in Chapter 7 is how to create widened lines. In other words, how to widen the lines of your pattern, and also there is a section on weaving. Moving on to Chapter 8. Now Chapter 8 is all about developing new patterns, and there are a number of ways of doing this. So once you've created one pattern, there are some really pretty nice simple techniques for creating variations of that pattern, or even completely new patterns. So therefore, you're utilizing, or may even be extending, that original framework of grid lines that you created for your initial pattern. I'm not going to go into that in detail. There are 10 methods for developing new patterns within the Encyclopedia, so if you want to see those, you'll just have to buy the Encyclopedia. Chapter 9 was touched on when we covered Chapter 5. That is, this chapter expands on how to create a greater number and variety of dynamic rectangles. That is pretty much Volume 1 covered. We've looked at the properties of Islamic geometric patterns. We've looked at the types of symmetry systems, the geometric pattern art rules. We've looked at the tools and techniques, and the drawing of the main rectangles. We've touched on those. And in Chapter 6, we looked again at the systematic approach, and that all came down to constructing a quarter of the pattern, or quadrant, and then through the use of reflection or translation, build the unit that is made up of 4 quadrants, and the tessellation of that unit to create the final pattern. And then we looked at tessellation, and then we just touched on developing new patterns. So that is pretty much it for Volume 1. Next up, we'll have a look at Volume 2 and Volume 3. Let's have a look at Volume 2. So Volume 2 is all about fourfold patterns drawn within a square. There are 101 examples, and each of these examples shows you step by step how to draw each pattern. Let's start off with a simple pattern, and I've got one in front of me now, so that's on page 12. And we can see from, if we just back up a bit to the beginning, so this is a simple pattern. Going back to page 10, we can see what we are going to draw. And we can see in step 1 we have a square. We have that arc which we have seen before. And then we are using the radius from the center of the square to set the size of 4 arcs that we are going to place in the corners. Then we can start connecting the lines that we have drawn, or at least connecting the points on the outer edge of the square. And then we can trace over some of those construction lines, and we have our completed pattern, which you can see on the right. So this is a nice simple example, but what it shows you is how to construct the pattern step by step. And for the 101 patterns in this volume, all of them are demonstrated the same way, so it's all quite easy to follow. Let's have a look at this pattern behind me and how that is constructed. So on page 14, we have the pattern that is behind me. So now you can see how it is constructed. We've got step 1, starting with a square, drawing some diagonals. And again, we are establishing a point along one of those diagonals using an arc. And then we are constructing 4 arcs in each corner, and the radius is set as you can see it here. In step 4, we are connecting all of the points from the outside perimeter of the square, as you can see here. And that gives us this pattern. Now in step 7, what we are seeing there is that the pattern that we have drawn, the quadrant that we have drawn, has been reflected in the vertical axis and the horizontal axis, and that gives us our unit, which can then be tessellated to form the pattern on the right hand side there. So that's pretty much what I wanted to show you from this chapter. All of these patterns are drawn within a square, and actually let's just zoom to the end because some of the patterns are more complex. And so this is pattern 85, and I'm just going to show you the pages just so that you can see that there are more steps involved in creating this pattern, and the finished pattern is on page 498, and that is on the left here. So that in a nutshell is volume 2. It's just one chapter. There are 101 examples that you can follow, so you can still build a wide range of patterns within a square. That is, a wide range of fourfold patterns within a square. So I imagine further down the track there will be more patterns that are drawn within, for example, a root 2 rectangle. And so I'm looking forward to seeing those volumes further down the track. Now it's time to have a look at Volume 3. Volume 3, as I mentioned before, includes 5-fold patterns drawn within a standard tan 54 rectangle, and there are 46 of these. That is 46 patterns, and that is 46 sets of instructions for creating 5-fold patterns. And Chapter 2 includes 35 examples of 6-fold patterns drawn within a root 3 rectangle. Let's start with the 5-fold patterns in a standard rectangle. There are 46 of these. I'm just going to show you the first one, and then we will move on to having a look at an example of a 6-fold pattern in Chapter 2 of Volume 3. Let's have a look at the first example in Volume 3, Chapter 1. So this is perhaps the simplest 5-fold pattern. If we have a look at step 1, here we have that tan 54 rectangle And the grid or framework on which we are going to start constructing the complete grid is just the basics of the tan 54 rectangle with the angles divided into 18 degrees. So if we look at each of the wedges on this tan 54 rectangle, we have 18 degree angles, and there are 5 of them which add up to 90 degrees. So in terms of drawing this rectangle, that is covered in volume 1. All of the patterns within this chapter all start with this rectangle, and so we're not redrawing it and we're not going over it right now how to construct the tan 54 rectangle. So let's just start with this rectangle and start building our patterns. As I mentioned, this is a nice simple pattern. So what we first need to do is establish the radius in step 2 of the first circle that we are going to draw, and we are going to create copies of these arcs with this radius set as shown in step 2. Then in step 3 it's a matter of joining up the intersection points, or a select number of intersection points, to establish the quadrant that we can clearly see in step 5. And then we are taking this quadrant and we are reflecting it in the y-axis and then the x-axis, or the other way around if you want to do that, in order to create the unit which will be tessellated, as we can see on page 5. So that is a typical example of how to construct a 5-fold pattern. Let's move on to a 6-fold pattern. Let's have a look at chapter 2 of volume 3, and this chapter contains 35 6-fold patterns that are constructed within a root 3 rectangle. Now, I just briefly want to talk about the root 3 rectangle, because similar to the root 2 rectangle, when you fold the root 3 rectangle up, and that is 2 folds, in other words you're dividing the rectangle in thirds, what you end up with is 3 smaller root 3 rectangles, and if you keep folding the same way, you just generate more and more root 3 rectangles. They just get smaller and smaller. So similar to the root 2 rectangle, when you fold it in half, you ended up with 2 root 2 rectangles. When you fold a root 3 rectangle into thirds, you end up with 3 smaller root 3 rectangles. So that is an interesting property that I just wanted to mention here. Let's have a look at the first example within this chapter. So we have a simple 6-fold pattern, and we can see that we've got a starting point. So we've got a root 3 rectangle, some lines that have already been drawn for us. So this is a basic starting point for drawing 6-fold patterns. So let's have a go at this. In step 2, we can see that we've established a radius, and we've used that radius to draw 2 arcs in opposite corners of the rectangle. And then it's just a matter of connecting up some of those points that we have established on the perimeter of the rectangle with some of the intersection points within the rectangle. And we've got basically our quadrant all finished. So if we have a look at step 5, this is the full quadrant that we are drawing. Then in step 6, we are reflecting this quadrant in the horizontal axis and then in the vertical axis, or the other way around, it doesn't really matter. And on the right hand side we see the completed pattern with its 6 pointed stars and hexagons. And if you recall, when I was talking in volume 1 about root 3 rectangles, I was talking actually about tessellation in that area. I said we don't tessellate hexagons. Now of course, if you're in the business of creating ceramic tiles, you're going to create a hexagon. But if you are designing the pattern, you would design it first in a rectangle, just as we have done here, in this case a root 3 rectangle. Let's have a look at one more example of a 6-fold pattern while we're here. And what I'll do is zoom right to the end and look at the last pattern. So this is pattern 35 of chapter 2, volume 3. So step 1, again, we've got that basic root 3 rectangle. We've got angles. All of these angles, or at least wedges this time, are 15 degrees, and there are 6 of them. and 6 times 15 equals 90 degrees. In step 2, we are drawing a diagonal line. In step 3, we are establishing the radius of one of the arcs that we are going to draw in the opposite bottom corner. And then we're going to establish in step 4 another radius, which we are going to also repeat on the other side of the rectangle at the point shown. So here we get a little bit more complex, and we are going to establish another arc in step 5, and again repeat that on the other side. And we are also going to establish yet another arc, as in another radius, and we are going to draw 2 arcs in opposing corners, and that is step 6. In step 7, we are going to join up some of the points around the perimeter with a point or two within the rectangle, because we've established some points where we can do that. In step 8, we have another arc to establish, and we are going to draw 2 arcs in opposite corners as shown. Then in step 9, it starts to get a little bit more complex, but again we're going to establish the radius of another set of arcs to draw the circles that you see there. In step 10, we've got more points that we can join up, and you can start to see the petals forming. In step 11, we are going to establish yet another radius, as you can see here, and we're going to draw 2 arcs. In step 12, we've got more points that we can join up. In step 13, we are going to establish another arc, and we just need the one, because we're using that to establish another arc in step 14, and again we'll draw 2 of these. In step 15, we can also join up more points now that we've got more intersection points and we've established more points around the perimeter. In step 16, we've got another radius to establish and 2 arcs to draw. In step 17, there's a few intersection points to join up with some lines. And in step 18, we can start to draw out our pattern just by tracing over the grid lines that we have established. And that gives us step 19, we just finish off. So in step 20, we see the finished quadrant. In step 21, as before, what we're going to do is reflect that quadrant in the x-axis and then reflect both quadrants in the y-axis to complete the unit, which is tessellated on the right-hand side to form the complete pattern. Now we have pretty much covered what I wanted to cover. You've got some examples of how you can create some of these patterns. Obviously, I'm not going to show you all of them because you should just buy the encyclopedia when it is published. So that is pretty much what I wanted to cover in this review. I think you've got a pretty good idea that Volume 1 now covers a lot of the theory, a lot of the rules, the principles, the steps in constructing a wide range but limited number of rectangles for creating the grids upon which you would build your patterns. We've also looked at volumes 2 and 3, and we just looked at some examples of creating 4-fold patterns within a square, creating 5-fold patterns within the standard tan 54 rectangle, and we've also looked at creating 6-fold patterns using a root 3 rectangle. And as I've mentioned already, in terms of constructing all of these rectangles that we've looked at today, or used today, that is all covered in Volume 1. That is the step-by-step instructions to create the rectangles that you can use to build your grids upon which you can construct your patterns. So that's it from me. But before I go, I'd like to go full circle and come back to talking briefly about the traditional method. So with Islamic geometric patterns, the key factors or features are tessellation, symmetry, and proportion. So tessellation is pretty easy to understand. You're basically taking the unit that you've created and rubber stamping it across a surface. So that is one way of looking at it. When it comes to symmetry, we looked at reflection in the examples we used. So once you create your quadrant, you reflect it in the y-axis, and then you reflect it in the x-axis to create the unit that you're going to tessellate. When it comes to proportion, I think things get a little bit sort of crazier and more complex and a little more difficult to understand. I mean, that's how I find it. Things aren't linear. So even if you get to grips with understanding the root 2 rectangle and how you can subdivide it, or even the root 3 rectangle and how you can subdivide it, when it comes to the golden rectangle, we don't actually use that at all. We use, for example, the tan 54 rectangle, and that doesn't exhibit the same property. But the interesting thing is when you create five-fold patterns with, for example, the tan 54 rectangle, you find the golden ratio embedded within the shapes that you create. Now, this is not something you're necessarily going to find in other methods. So, for example, if you hear someone say that when it comes to designing Islamic geometric patterns that you always start with a circle, you should instantly know that you are in the wrong place, because you should always start with a rectangle, and that is what I like about the traditional method. So I have been studying the traditional method for 5 years now. 5 years ago, I discovered Mohamad Aljanabi's Facebook group. I joined that group, and within a month or two, Mohamad ran his first class. I signed up and paid for that class, and I'm pretty sure it was in the first lesson when he mentioned dynamic symmetry, I knew I was in the right place, because I have tried in the past to follow other people's methods. I've tried in the past to try and work it out for myself in terms of trying to design Islamic geometric patterns. And even though I had a grounding in dynamic symmetry, I never really put the two together. So I think when you study the traditional method, it will open up new opportunities for you in terms of learning and comprehending the dynamic nature of pattern creation using this method. And if you follow the rules, you will always draw correctly constructed Islamic geometric patterns. And that, from my experience, is not the case with any of the other methods. And on that note, I would like to thank Mohamad Aljanabi for the opportunity to have a look at this encyclopedia, and also to have the opportunity to review it and share it with you today. I would also like to thank Mohamad for sharing this method with the world, because, as I mentioned previously, without having this method as comprehensively documented as Mohamad has here, this method could easily be lost altogether. As I mentioned, the current practitioners may not pass on to the next generation, because the next generation may not be that interested. So there is always the possibility that, given that there aren't many practitioners of the traditional method anymore, that this method could have been lost. So I'm very grateful to Mohamad for publishing this method. And on that note, I'd now like to say goodbye, and hope you purchase the encyclopedia when it is released and give the traditional method a go.